One of the things that we wanted to do with this plenary was obviously to kind of set the stage for the rest of the day and to give you all an opportunity to hear the thoughts of two impressive leaders in the field. But I think an important question to start with is really about the symposium itself, right? That it's predicated on this idea and a notion that Vienna was, in fact, critically important to all of us in this room and to those outside of the room. There was a declaration and a consensus document that was really supposed to present to the international community a common plan for action and to really unify the world around a global framework. But I think one, obvious question to start with is how critical was it really, and what was so important?
We can start with the contribution of the Center for Women's Global Leadership in terms of really putting women's rights as human rights in the center of the human rights debate. And for those of you who weren't born in 1993, this seems kind of unusual that you would think that women's rights are not human rights. Well, actually 20 years ago, people didn't think so. So this was an amazing contribution to the human rights movement, but also had very practical consequences, such as having a special rapporteur on violence against women, having the International Criminal Court look at violence against women as an international crime. So there were quite a few things that happened because of that. Other than the women's rights as human rights, many other important things happened in Vienna. One was the establishment of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So now the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights is an incredibly important UN agency that looks at human rights. Well, it didn't exist before 1993. And so the establishment of the High Commission, the governance issues, and how internationally we play the human rights issues in intergovernmental negotiation was established in 1993. The other one was that poverty, extreme poverty, was considered a human rights violation. That's an incredibly important issue for us to think about, right? That until then, that wasn't considered important. It's also important to remember that in 1993, it was just the end of the Cold War. And so it was a way to bring issues of universality, interdependence of rights into the mainstream of the human rights movement. So that's another one. And the last one is that the development and the right to development and the right to economic development was considered a human rights issue, right? Which means that, and I'm not saying that all of this, therefore, we solve the world, but these were very significant contributions of the 1993 conference that we've built on as we've gone forward.
My question to you all is, how does the human rights framework and norms offer us a lens, an analytic framework, and an organizing framework to deal with what seems to be competing interests on these fronts of giving up some of your freedom from fear?
Can I go first before you criticize me? Because I was going to make segue, right?
Okay.
So Vienna was that turning point, right? Vienna was that turning point in taking what were the initial universal human rights framework that had been bifurcated in the Cold War. The West took civil and political rights. My organization is largely civil and political rights oriented. The Eastern Bloc countries took economic and social rights. The Berlin Wall falls. Vienna happens. Oh my God, they're indivisible. They should be integrated. So Vienna was that first moment where the bricks were put back alongside of each other and we began to fill in the mortar. And I think that's an important breaking point for us. I mean, that's where actually, when you look at the human rights movement in the US, you have to look post-Vienna. Because I think much of the reason that happened, the reason why we exported human rights was one problem. Export, international, domestic, civil liberties, civil rights. Then you also had this schism of the Cold War. Civil and political rights, it's what we care about in America, not economic and social rights, is not justiciable in the courts the way that civil and political rights are. But that's changed after 1993. And I think Vienna was that moment, and that's where I don't want to kind of totally throw away the baby with the bathwater. It's important to have the principles, the framework, the intellectual building blocks that then help you see connections that were always there and that needed to be reinforced. And that's the process we're in right now, trying to rebuild those connections of seeing human rights as a domestic issue, of seeing economic and social rights clearly alongside of civil and political rights, and trying to reconstruct that kind of unified fabric of human rights.
Okay,
I tried to clean it up a little bit.
A little bit.
Before, yeah. Not enough?
But no, not enough. I mean, I think part of the problem of this, what you said about the exportation of human rights and not here, is really the exceptionalism of the U.S. government in terms of assuming that human rights don't matter here. And obviously there are people in the room and who are going to speak later on today about starting a human rights movement where human rights actually apply to this country. And so, to me, I think the ACLU is a little behind the times to catch up to this movement that has already taken on human rights and has an enormous impact already in, with 350 organizations, including the ACLU, to start a human rights movement.
I think what my organization does is critical to the global human rights movement. Even though we only focus on the U.S. or the excesses of power of the American government, we hold the American government's feet to the fire on its human rights violations. And so by doing so, we are able to say that, yes, the hypocrisy exists, yes, the violations of rights exist in America, but yes, there's a vibrant NGO community which is fighting its own government to make sure that we adhere to this principle. We have to look to the international field and international law. How crazy is it that we would willingly accept every type of international legal instrument on all other aspects of human life? Global agreement on tariffs and trade, laws of the sea, climate change, everything. I mean,
No.
But on all the economic sphere, and that's all good. And the businesses, patents, trademarks, piracy of intellectual property. We understand the importance of international law for business and for commerce. But in the context of human rights, we say, oh, well, international law shouldn't apply.
I think your point, Anthony, about how the U.S. has signed all these international agreements and does not look at the kind of human rights issues as something applicable requires us to think about human rights and its applicability in a different way.
Right.
And so some of the work that we've been doing and others in the room have been doing is to say, okay, what does a human rights framework say about the World Trade Organization?
Right.
And how do we evaluate those trade agreements based on human rights principles? How do we look at the current framework of austerity in terms of an application of human rights? The ways in which many governments of the Global South are saying, wait, this human rights thing is an imperialist strategy, I don't blame them. Because it can be an imperialist strategy. They could say, well, you know what, we're not going to trade with you unless your labor rights are good. But then who's violating those labor rights? It's the U.S. corporations that are going there and saying, unless you work for really low wages, we're not going to give you money. And so I think I completely understand the need to be careful and suspicious of ways in which human rights as a discourse is being pushed. But I think what it requires on us in terms of human rights thinkers and activists is to turn the frame around on them. I was at a panel recently, about a year ago, with someone from the World Bank who said, yes, we believe in rights-based development and we're with you. And I said, well, you know what? The human rights framework says that the kind of policies that the World Bank puts in place is a violation of a country's obligations on human rights. And the World Bank looked at me and said, wait, you mean human rights could be used against us? And I said, yeah, it's to hold you conditional, not putting conditionalities on other governments.
Well, if our clients, our cases, our issues look exactly the same after the economic meltdown of 2008, then we're missing the boat. Yep. If our docket looks exactly the same, then what are we doing here, people? And they said, well, economic issues are not justiciable. I'm like, okay, I get it. Just apply an ESCR frame to the cases and clients you bring. Yep. And so I think the international mechanisms provide you redress, provide you an avenue. And slowly but surely, the courts are coming around to it. If you look at two of the most recent Supreme Court cases on the death penalty for people who committed crimes when they were juveniles, and also on the LGBT issue on the Lawrence versus Texas, the Supreme Court cases all cite in the footnote international law.
We can't just look at the state. And what we need to look at is extraterritorial obligations, not just within the state, but for example, the financial crisis and the regulatory framework that changed in the U.S. had an impact all around the world. how do we construct an economy and a world that is based in as its ethical lens a human rights framework.
But that does lead us to a question about the 21st century and kind of where the movement is headed and how that movement can both include more young people and a building of the base. Oftentimes within these movements, we're talking to ourselves. So how do we bring more people into the tent? How do we use the framework as a mobilizing and organizing and education tool? And so what does the 21st century of the movement look like? How will it be different? And what does it need to do? And I'll give you each a minute and a half if you all will bear with us. We'll just start a couple of minutes late for the next panel.
Wow, okay, so I think in a minute and a half, I think that the way the movement has to go as we move forward is from the ground up. The change has to come from people. And so what we need is the young people sitting in this room to go out there and protest the fact that our government is shut down. Right? You need to understand why that has an impact.
The golden age of human rights is in front of us. It's phenomenal. Forget the institutions. Let's talk about the movements, right? There's no way you're going to tell me. I mean, first off, the whole human rights movement was the greatest success, sine qua non, of the 20th century, right? We come out of the ashes of World War II. The world realizes that we're responsible for each other no matter where you live and what country or passport you carry. And then we build a framework around it. That is phenomenal. Now, the question for us who are human rights NGOs, leaders, is can we adapt? Will we adapt? Will we accept leadership from the Global South? Critically important. We need to adapt as organizations because there is something to be said for organizations. Organizations have staying power. You know, human rights movements can kind of blossom and flourish, and then they can contract. But you need an institution that's going to stay the steady course, that's going to keep, you know, like water on stone. And without institutions that have the capacity with that staying power, you're going to have these bursts of breakthroughs, but you're not going to have the long-term change. And so those of us who are privileged enough to be charged with these jobs have to be thinking the long term.
I'm really thrilled to be following that introductory conversation because I was trying to think about how I could tell you stories about what it was like to organize women globally for the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights, because in many ways, as Tony described it, we were the insurgents. Yes. None of us had been in the halls of the UN very much, maybe at women's conferences, but certainly not in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and Commission. And in many ways, I think what we were doing is what he described at the end, which is how new actors enter into and claim human rights for yourself, how groups that have not traditionally had the everydayness of violation in their lives recognized as important like human rights. And that is very much what the Women's Rights as Human Rights movement, the global campaign, was trying to do, to show that the everyday violations, in this case of women, but I think it's true across the board, are every much serious human rights abuses as any other issue. And this was, at the time, Radhika said it, really sort of unheard of, and we were told many times things like one of the major professional human rights organizations, I won't name, but probably the largest, said that women hijacked the conference in Vienna. And that's because they were not prepared for new actors to claim this, what was, I think, before Vienna, a very professionalized human rights field. So for me, the most important thing about Vienna is not only women's rights as human rights, which is a symbol of that, but also the way in which Vienna opened the door for many new groups. Many more groups from the Global South were present, groups from the indigenous peoples, women, groups that had not traditionally been seen as defining the international human rights agenda.
I'm the founder of the oldest displaced women organization in Colombia called the Displaced Women League. This is a women's organization who lead actually in Colombia the process of restitution of land and restitution and reparation for the last, 20 years of displacement in our cases. Yeah. Yes, I'm listening, Charlotte, and I start to remind all this hard fight that we did in the last 20 years. That purpose of my job, of my life, really, because I'm mother and grandmother also, is to trespass this historical heritage to the new generations, because we really are in really danger in this moment with all the things that we supposed to get to got in that time. I remember, Charlotte, when I was in the Japan International Tribunal and Comfort Women in Japan together, and we bring the witness from the armed conflict, and I bring and that tribunal women from Colombia. Yes, and the history of the legal resistance that we start, from the Vienna, and after that the fight for the International Criminal Court to put all these crimes against women in the agenda, which mean forced prostitution, forced abortion, sexual slavery, genocide is rape as genocide, and all these kind of crimes against women who never appeared before. You can imagine that genocide had passed first, and the rape 100 of women in the República Democrática del Congo or in Yugoslavia, even in other countries. First is the genocide, first is all the hundreds of rape, and then the law came. So this is very difficult, because first is the genocide and second is the law. So how you can work in this kind of situation? But you have to do.
So in 1993, the year of the German Vienna Conference, the first president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, affirmed that all freedoms and hence oppressions are interdependent. And this, for me, speaks critically to this thing called intersectionality that Charlotte Bunch touched on earlier, which is really the study of the interactions of multiple systems of oppression or discrimination and its intersections with privilege. Intersectionality influenced South Africa's groundbreaking constitutional equality clause, which guarantees the rights of all peoples, including on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, or soggy, as some people say, very soggy, wet. Vienna was a groundbreaking intersectional moment for us as well, affirming that human rights is a universal standard and emphasizing the indivisible, interdependent nature of human rights, quoting the Center for Women's Global Leadership, specifically in response to the historic divide between civil and political rights on the one hand and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand. So intersectionality shows how biological, social, and cultural categories like gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, and other axes of identity ad infinitum interact on multiple and often simultaneous levels, contributing to systematic social inequity. Intersectionality holds that the classical conceptions of oppression within society, like this racism, sexism, homophobia, blah, blah, religion, belief-based prejudice, and all that, do not act independently of one another, but instead these forms of oppression interrelate, creating a system of oppression, a sort of a web that reflects the intersection of these multiple forms of discrimination.
I want to share some reflections stepping back from my role with women's movements and stepping forward in my role at the UN. So, I mean, we're here to really, celebrate and reflect on this landmark agreements of Vienna 20 years ago. And I think we should be aware of that these achievements of the 1990s were not constructed in a tidy, sort of linear historical way, and that each era, especially that era, has a lot of paradoxes, and that we need to be mindful of, and that the drive to actually achieve those outcomes came from social justice and women's rights movements in really contesting those paradoxes and giving shape to the results. So if we step backward, as was discussed in the opening panel, as we know, the whole creation of human rights instruments came about after World War II, the horrible experience of Nazism, national liberation struggles all across the global south, and of course the weight of the Cold War. So it was, again, not states, but human rights and social justice movements that really pushed the UN to focus on human rights. And women were very much a part of these movements and of national liberation struggles across the global south in particular.
So going back to the process and the Vienna conference, what we heard and what some of us are very familiar with is that the Vienna conference is actually the outcome of a process, and that process did not start by a few government officials sitting in a room and deciding that they are going to change the language, but it started because thousands of women and men were fighting for their basic rights, and that did not necessarily start in Europe.
You said, Zakia, about the importance of understanding that the human rights language is not just from the North. I have to say that I did not use human rights language when I was in the US. It was 10 years of working with women in the global south in the 1980s that convinced me that we should be framing women's rights as human rights.
I was intimately involved with the struggle to prevent my government from privatizing water in the late 1990s, so soon after our liberation in 1994. It shocked us deeply as activists that our state could do such an unconscionable thing. And this germinal moment when they sold water to private corporations with enormously disastrous results. Many other things have been allowed in my country, a bit like Obama appointing a former head of the GMO to a key position in the United States. So selling our indigenous knowledge from seeds to pharmaceuticals and so on.
So some people say the revolution will not be funded. In the 90s, it was funded. Governments put in a lot of money into supporting advocacy work. And that's what allowed hundreds and thousands to participate and to meet regularly enough that one could generate those kinds of alliances. Those same governments that funded advocacy in that era, and foundations as well, private foundations, shifted after the conference era into funding the so-called solutions, very narrow, siloed solutions, some technical fixes. So that shift to come back in this period to really look at supporting movements, again, has not quite happened.
There are very well-designed and well-orchestrated, deeply embedded technical systems that underpin poverty and inequality, that drive poverty and inequality on a systemic level. By this I mean that there are ways in which the systems in place create, maintain, and perpetuate many of the things that we've heard about today, from patriarchy to racism to inequalities and marginalization, and the asymmetry and imbalance of North and South. Now, we're in a context today where we're seeing multiple intersecting and interdependent crises, right? We're seeing a crisis of finance and economy kicked off by 2007. We're seeing that of climate change and the environment. And we're also very particularly seeing a crisis of food security. Basic food staples and commodities have become the newest grounds for financial gambling in the international markets. These global crises are underpinned by a crisis of governance. There are international institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, global bodies such as the G20 and G8. There are abstract banking supervision bodies such as the Bank for International Settlements based in Switzerland. And there is the OECD and the Paris Club, which is the club of the richest 8 countries, the US and Europe. Why does this matter for human rights? The basic economic and social and cultural rights of people around the world are structurally impacted by the current international financial and macroeconomic architecture.
I work with the U.S. Human Rights Network. For those of you who don't know, the U.S. Human Rights Network is a network of organizations and individuals working to strengthen a human rights movement and a human rights culture within the United States. And in particular, human rights movement at the grassroots level, led by people who are most directly impacted by human rights violations, a people-centered human rights movement. Our work focuses on human rights in the United States, and we do so because often that's not what's thought about. In fact, one of the two most frequent responses or reactions I get when I tell someone I'm a human rights activist is they ask questions about international human rights violations, or, and this is happening more in the South, they ask me questions about human trafficking. Now, don't get me wrong, gross human rights violations are happening all over the world, and human trafficking, labor and sex trafficking are gross human rights violations, so I don't say that to diminish that. What I am saying is that there are a whole lot of other human rights concerns that we should be talking about, and a lot of them human rights violations happening right here in the United States. So we really focus on these human rights violations, the full range of trying to realize a full range of human rights, because they're linked mostly to poverty and inequality, and then affect a whole range of other issues in our lives.
I think that there's a red thread which is running through this symposium, and that has to do with our critique of neoliberalism and our pointing out that neoliberal policies have not been working for the majority of the world's people, including the majority of Americans, and the profound need to really rethink what we mean by growth and what policies are best for economic growth, and what policies are best not for economic growth in and of itself, but economic growth as it will promote the realization of human rights. Because after all, what's the point of growth if people are not able to access water, healthcare, education, etc.?
Progress we've made in advancing the economic and social rights dimensions of the Vienna agenda. As has been said this morning, Vienna was really a watershed for these rights, for economic and social and cultural rights, which are recognized in the Declaration of Rights of an equal standing with civil and political rights, and indivisible and interdependent from them. The language is very unequivocal. The international community must treat all human rights globally in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis. And as was said this morning, this was really significant because during the Cold War, ESC rights had been seen very much as second-class rights, vague aspirations rather than enforceable entitlements. In fact, the phrase fundamental rights, which is in the title of this event, has often been used to refer primarily to civil and political rights at the exclusion of economic, social, and cultural. And I think the Vienna Declaration, one of the great things it did was bring down that Berlin Wall between the two so-called categories of rights, and it signaled an end to their comparative marginalization. As was said this morning as well, Vienna was also a defining moment in terms of the relationship between human rights, in articulating the relationship between human rights and poverty. It was probably the first time that a human rights document recognized extreme poverty and social exclusion as constituting a violation of human dignity. And it called for a more mutually reinforcing relationship between human rights and development efforts. And significantly, it stressed the obligation of all states to work together to create an equitable and favorable economic environment at the international level, which would be conducive to not just to lasting development, but to the realization of human rights.
Oftentimes, when it comes to education, human rights are seen as questions of access to an already created structure. But it is also a question of having the adequate support and opportunities to contribute to knowledge production and help to effectively transform the research methods, teachings, and pedagogical practices that continue to promote social, institutional, and epistemological exclusion.
Buenas tardes. Okangli kutan chuhunil. My name is Norma Maldonado. I salute you in Maya Quechua language too. During 1954, Guatemala was occupied by the CIA and had a coup d'etat. Because of what? Because of banana company owned by the Dulles brothers. And so we have a coup d'etat, and we were imposed a military dictatorship. So I was born under that dictatorship. So I had not one day of peace in my life, not one. So thanks to these companies, so this is nothing new. Now the division of the world is coming with the trade agreements. And with what my friend Hibumika was talking here with the WTO, those trade agreements are WTO plus. So whatever we didn't gain on the WTO negotiations is being dealt on the trade agreements. So by law, with supranational laws, all these companies are going there and getting whatever they need to compete in the world. So we can be developed, they say. And guess what? Guatemala produces food. It's a center origin of its species. And we're the most malnourished country in the hemisphere. Overwhelming. But overwhelming for us down there too. Believe me, tiring. So we have internal conflict. Since the 80s, we sent all these youth to live in the United States. They were persecuted like animals, and the border, the migrants. I work with the migrants here in LA, and people had no rights whatsoever. Not even right to have a name of their own, because they have to invent names for the Social Security.
The emergence of authoritarian regimes in the Arab world reflects a sordid history of colonial rule and post-colonial interventions that have created oppositional politics among states within the Middle East. The Middle East, is also rich in natural resources like gas and oil, and has been one of the most penetrated regions by foreign interests, as gruesomely demonstrated by the 2003 Iraq War. Arab governments, mostly, became authoritarian after their decolonization from French and British rule following the Second World War and well after. The Palestine has not been amongst those to be liberated. The authoritarian regimes cultivated popular legitimacy by combining authoritarianism with a redistributive welfare state in what political scientists refer to as authoritarian populism. Despite significant opposition, most Arab populations welcomed this social contract. In exchange for political and civil rights, regimes would provide economic stability in the form of basic goods like subsidized food and housing, as well as the security to live free of internecine violence. This social contract, however, quickly began to unravel. GDP growth rates generally rose with the beginning of populist policies, and the public sector expansion began to quickly fall in the 1980s as a result of a combination of repression, corruption, and mismanagement. As Arab authoritarian regimes have entered into the globalized economy through neoliberal prescriptions, they began to privatize public goods like water, electricity, housing, and education through PPPs. By steadily retracting redistributive policies whilst maintaining authoritarian governance, Arab authoritarian populists breached their tenuous social contracts. By the 2000s, as the gap between rich and poor expanded, and as gender and other social-based disparities deepened within Arab countries, their aggregate economic figures oddly improved, but at the dire expense of equitable distribution. The IMF, for example, in 2010 praised Tunisia's, quote, sound policies and reforms for helping the country weather the global downturn. The inverse relationship between aggregate and socioeconomic development is not unique to the Arab world. In fact, its ubiquitous character among developing states especially reflects the principles first captured in the 1986 UN Declaration of the Right to Development and later affirmed by the 1993 Vienna World Conference on Human Rights.
So in the case of Africa, when we think about some of the structural hindrances, we need to transform our economies. So there's a lot of discussion right now about transforming our economies to move away from primary extraction, from just doing low value add agriculture and services, to talk more about production, to talk more about better diversified economies, and to talk about greater justice in terms of the management of our natural resource wealth. We are insisting that we have to curb illicit financial flows, the wealth that leaves the continent. I mean, listening to Norma, I could relate a lot to what she was describing about Guatemala. So we need to plug those leaks because we're not going to develop. Where are we going to get the resources to develop if so much leaves the continent? But that we also have to talk about sustainable, and sustainability in this sense also is about equity. Economic growth has to be sustainable but also equitable. To do all of this, we have to strengthen the capability of the state to deliver these essential services to citizens, to address inequalities and so on and so forth. So in Africa, there's a lot of talk about developmental capable states. And it's deliberate that we're saying that, because development has to be also the business of states. We cannot have the scenarios when we had restructured adjustment programs where then you have NGOs, you're saying charitable organizations and others will step in and try and fill for the missing gap. It's not possible. We have to have the states being capable and feeling that this is their core responsibility and that they can deliver. The third thing that I wanted to talk about, and sorry if they sound a bit disjointed, I feel like I'm just signposting, is that we need workable accountability and financing strategies. These have to be built into this post-2015 development framework. Why is that important? We have to transform state-citizen relationships, and taxation is at the heart of this discussion. And why this matters is because you then enhance accountability. It means that you can get better economic governance. You can have better accountability for the use of public resources. You can have a more participative democracy. So before we can have this new understanding, before we can have any meaningful or any shifts in the kind of partnerships that we're talking about, then we need to face head-on some of these hindrances. Just as I end with the 1 minute, I will signpost some of the key post-2015 processes that, again, coming from the point of view that we can wield influence. Between now and September 2014, we have the work of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. And again, this is building on the work of the Rio Conference, Rio +20, and so on and so forth. We need to engage these processes even as they're moving into the intergovernmental phase. I mean, who make up the governments? We elect governments. And as citizens, we need to remember that we still should hold our governments to account, so that even when these intergovernmental processes are happening, we still reserve the right and must engage these processes to be accountable to the things that we desire, the things that we need to see happen through. So there's that. There's the work of the Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Financing. So financing is going to be a big discussion. And then there's a process to develop options for technology facilitation mechanism. The actual intergovernmental negotiations will only be launched after September 2014. And the target is to, by September 2015, adopt the agenda, which means essentially we have a full year plus. And I feel that there's time to actually make a difference. We need to engage national governments. We need to influence the outcomes. I feel that it is up to citizens, and it's up to citizens' organizations to make a difference by calling on governments to be accountable. They're not a law unto themselves. Thank you.
So, I'm here to do one significant thing by way of looking back and looking forward. An Igbo proverb tells us if you can't tell where the rain began to beat you, you will not know when the sun dried your body. That is to say, if you don't know your past, you cannot articulate your future. This whole day has tried to keep us mindful of that truth. We have to know what led to Vienna and what came out of it before we can understand the work we need to continue to do. In many respects, it would have been easy for the center simply to look back on, a glorious past. Look what we managed to pull off. But that's not what today has been about, because the center is not ever about that. The center is about the work we have to do. And today has been to let us understand what we did so we can know how to continue.